So the high-speed rail route linking London to the northwest will go ahead. The Transport Secretary Justine Greening described it as the most significant transport infrastructure project since the building of the motorways. The first stage will see trains run between London and Birmingham in 49 minutes. It will eventually run on to Manchester and Leeds, though that route has yet to be finalised. High-speed trains would then be able to link up with existing services to Scotland. Extra lines will connect to Heathrow and the continent. Today, the government announced that more of the line will run through tunnels under northwest London, Great Missenden and Wendover, lessening the impact on the countryside and perhaps on Conservative support in those areas. Trains won't actually run along the line until 2026, but the arguments have already built up a fair head of steam. In a moment, I'll be going inside the pub here to talk to some of the people who will be affected. First, our political correspondent, Michael Crick, reports.
At Westminster, a cross-party group of MPs and the music producer Pete Waterman marked the day when, after 2 years of protest, High Speed 2 got the green light. It'll mean growth and jobs, they say, more trains and more seats.
So when it says more seats, does that more mean parliamentary seats?
Absolutely.
And critics say much of any growth will be diverted from places like Wales and Cornwall.
But isn't this just going to divert jobs and growth?
Yeah, we like diverting them. So to the north where we need them.
So there isn't an economic benefit then?
Of course there is. Because of the clogs. And get rid of our whippets.
After almost 55,000 public submissions, ministers have changed the route of HS2 slightly and the nature of that route. Through Ruislip, where protesters gathered this morning, the line will be hidden now by almost 3 miles of tunnel. That seems to have won round the London Mayor Boris Johnson just before he faces the voters in May. And most of the route through the Chilterns area of outstanding natural beauty will now be tunnel or deep cutting. But that still doesn't satisfy this couple who live right next to the planned line.
They've put a derogatory term NIMBY against us so that anything we say from now on they're going to say, oh, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Well, I'm afraid no. I call them nilties. NIILTY, not interested in listening to you. Economically, they've already had consultation on this, which says their own people who have said there is no backing for any economic sense in this at all.
Ministers say the full HS2 Y-shaped scheme going on to Manchester and Leeds will cost £32.7 billion at current prices. But they claim that will be offset by up to £47 billion of benefits to the rest of the economy, plus up to £34 billion in fare revenue over 60 years. Those gains should be greatest, it's claimed, in Birmingham and northwards.
It's worth every penny because you're talking about long-term investment in infrastructure. This country for too long has lived off scraps, particularly in the Midlands. We haven't invested enough. France spending twice as much, Japan spending 6 times as much. Our infrastructure is creaking. The bills are now coming home to roost and we have to face up to them. But there is a business case. Every pound spent will bring another 2 in.
Justine Greening compares HS2 to Britain's last great railway project, the Great Central, which opened in 1899. But some Tory MPs, especially those along this new route, are sceptical.
How sure is she that the actual costs in their entirety of this project will be kept to the amount that we've been talking about? And how realistic is it for Britain at this very difficult economic time to be able to afford the cost of this project?
Well, I would argue that we can't afford not to do this.
HS2 involves economic arguments, environmental arguments and, of course, no end of politics at all levels. And today's announcement is by no means the end of the debate. This new railway will require legislation to go through Parliament. And there's also the strong possibility that objectors will try and challenge the railway in the courts.
But with Labour on board, HS2 may now be hard to stop. The best chance, through pressure on local Tory MPs and ministers, could well have passed.
Well, here with me now on the proposed route of the high-speed rail line are Martin Tett, the Conservative leader of Buckinghamshire County Council, and Steve Roderick, Chief Officer of the Chilterns Conservation Board. Martin Tett, the fact is the main artery, the country's main rail artery, the West Coast Main Line, will be full within a decade. So sadly, you're paying the price locally, but it's in the national interest, isn't it?
Well, of course, that's what the advocates argue. But, I mean, as local authorities... No, it's not. If you actually look at this, as local authorities, we're used to taking tough decisions, sometimes unpopular ones. But we've had independent experts look at this. Virtually every independent analyst has actually said the forecasts are exaggerated. They've got forecasts going forward to 2043, and everybody agrees you can't really forecast demand more than about 10 years. When you look at the business case, and you're talking about £32 billion worth of your money, my money, and everybody watching this programme's money, you have to make sure it's a good investment. And it's a very, very poor business case.
But business leaders, economists, union leaders, MPs, not all the MPs obviously, but a lot of MPs support this. Are they all wrong?
Well, I think what you've seen here is a classic Labour scheme from the old Labour regime. I saw Maria Eagle this afternoon stand up and say, remember, this was Gordon Brown's scheme. This is a classic tax and spend, massively expensive project, silver bullet to solve everything's problems. It isn't. The reality is there are better alternatives, far cheaper, and what we should be doing is investing in our infrastructure, but right across the country, rather than just on a single route to Birmingham.
Steve Roderick, the government's done a lot, hasn't it, to lessen the impact on the environment. There's a longer tunnel here in Wendover to make things better there. I think I'm right in saying that there's 2 miles of track at surface level through areas of outstanding natural beauty. The government has tried on an environmental level.
It certainly tried. It would be churlish to pretend it wasn't a slight improvement, but it hasn't changed anything. This is a nationally protected landscape, and they're still going to quarry their way through it. We're talking about millions of tonnes of spoil, years and years of disruption whilst heavy lorries use our quiet country lanes. Thousands of metres of ancient hedgerows and ancient woodlands are going to be dug up. It hasn't changed the overall picture. There's still an environmental disaster. And it's worth saying, isn't it, that when this began, it was supposed to be an environmental project. It was supposed to prevent flying. It was all about the third runway at Heathrow. The environmental credentials are nil. The whole environmental case is unravelled.
Well, they still reckon, the government today is saying 4.5 million air journeys a year. That won't happen if this goes ahead. 9 million journeys will come off the road. I mean, it is a low-carbon alternative, isn't it?
No, these are small numbers. These are small numbers. When you think how many people use the motorways, only 1% of motorway traffic is going to switch. Those short-haul flight slots that will be freed up will become long-haul slots. That's 10 times the amount of carbon emitted. Let's not forget, the Transport Select Committee, which looked in this in depth only last autumn, said this must not be called a carbon-reducing scheme. It's not. It will increase carbon emissions.
Martin Tett, this is a very conservative area. What's going to be the impact on the party here?
Well, it's clearly, obviously, a disappointing thing as far as the party's concerned. We seem to have inherited Labour's old big prestige project.
The Tories backed it, though.
Well, the coalition government has done that. Absolutely right. I can't deny that. It's obviously disappointing. It's a classic Labour scheme. The business case is appalling. It relies on the fact that every minute spent on a train is completely wasted. That's the only way the business case stacks up. And we know in an era of mobile phones and iPods that just isn't true.
So UKIP's going to enjoy a resurgence here?
Well, we're going to argue the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party and even parts of the Labour Party right the way along are united in opposition to this. We think there's a really good economic argument against this in times of austerity, when we're seeing cutbacks in hospitals and schools, quite rightly, to beat the sort of deficit we've got. To be spending this amount of money is just the wrong priority.
Martin Tett, Steve Roderick, thank you very much for joining us. The question is, do the numbers really add up? We've been fact-checking claims that HS2 will generate billions of pounds for the UK economy. You can see what we found out on our website. Go to channel4.com/news.